Last time we spoke about the Qing Boxers siege of Beijing and the Eight-Nation Alliance expedition led by Seymour. Baron von Ketele was murdered by Gansu soldiers, ushering in a real siege of the foreign legations in Beijing. The situation was dire, communications were cut, and soon the railways were also. The foreign ministers called for aid, and thus came an expedition of 8 nations led by Seymour to the rescue. Seymour's expedition started out quite well, but soon the Boxers disrupted the tracks, stopping them, well, in their tracks. To the dismay of the Westerners, it turned out the Qing were joining the Boxers in battle against them, and Seymour's force had to make a fighting withdrawal back to Tientsin. They fought all the way to a secret arsenal where they dug in, until another relief force finally rescued them. Now they all marched back to Tientsin as gunfire could be heard. This episode is The Boxer Rebellion Part 3, The Siege of Tientsin and the Battle of the Daku Forts. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. You can check out my entire episode on the Boxer Rebellion. It's a bit more of a visual experience. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find exclusive podcasts. The latest has been a two-parter on Emperor Hirohito's failures and responsibilities during the war. Check it out, it means a lot to me. When Seymour set out on his expedition, a lot of events had unfolded. I mentioned it a few times, but gunfire could be heard by his expeditionary forces coming from Tientsin. When thousands of Boxers began storming the region looking to kill Christians and foreigners, many flocked to Tientsin. Tientsin consisted of 2 adjacent but quite different subdivisions. To the northwest was an ancient high-walled Chinese city, around 1 mile per side. 2 miles southeast of this, along the high river, were the foreign settlements around half a mile wide. The Chinese city held around 1 million Chinese. The foreign settlements around 700 foreign civilians with their thousands of Chinese servants. The Boxers came at first to the railway station carrying placards and chain letters stating this: "Those who see this sheet and distribute 6 copies will deliver a whole family from calamity. If 10 sheets are circulated, they will save an entire district. If any see this handbill and fail to disseminate, they will certainly be beheaded." Within mere hours of Seymour's expedition departing, reinforcements were landed at Daku to head over to the foreign settlements at Tientsin to defend them. On June the 11th, Commander Beatty of the Royal Navy had 150 sailors, marines, and 2 Maxim machine guns with him. He would joined be a few days later by 1,600 Russians who rushed over to the scene from Port Arthur before their railway lines were cut by Boxers. Alongside the other nation forces, Tientsin had roughly 2,400 troops to defend the foreign settlements, facing a force of possibly 30,000 Boxers and 15,000 Qing soldiers camped nearby. On June the 15th, the Boxers began burning down all the missions outside the Chinese city, like Notre Dame de Victoire. They stormed the streets, attacking Chinese Christians, massacring as they went. They destroyed all Christian and foreign goods or property they could find. The foreigners in the settlement watched this unfold in horror from a distance. Then at 2 a.m. on the 16th, they were attacked. Beatty recalled seeing Boxers came in great strength, setting fire to all the houses and outlying villages they could. They came on quite heedless of the volleys we opened on them, never replying because the poor beggars had no arms to reply with, and coming up within 300 and 400 yards armed with swords, spears, and torches. So there we squatted, knocking them over as they came along. Chaos ensued in Tientsin as the admirals on their warships off the Daku fort bar became more and more anxious. The Western navies had received no word since June the 10th. Tientsin was clearly under attack and Seymour's expedition force was gone. Seymour's last message to them came on the 14th, and all evidence suggested the Boxers and Qing would block the way between them and Tientsin. The Qing naval forces were seen priming up torpedo tubes on their warships and laying mines in the river's mouth. The entire situation looked like a trap. If the Beiho River was closed, the naval squadrons would be unable to rush up to rescue the civilians at Tientsin and Beijing. On the 16th, the admirals met aboard the Russian flagship. They all formed a multinational ultimatum that was issued to the Qing, that the Daku forts had to be surrendered by 2 a.m. the next day or they would attack. A Russian officer was sent to deliver the message to the Daku fort commander, who responded, "I would be glad to surrender the forts, but I am here to obey orders." The French consul general in Tientsin then took it upon himself to telephone the local viceroy and advised him to surrender the Daku forts or face the consequences. The admirals knew their actions were tantamount to declaring war on China, and that taking the Daku forts would not be easy. The Daku forts at this time were 4 forts with pairs of 2 on each side of the river mouth. They had been recently rebuilt and reinforced by German engineers. The walls were made of mud mixed with chopped straw, which might sound silly, but this made them impervious to shell fire. Their garrison was around 3,000 men, equipped with quick-firing Krupp guns and other heavy pieces of artillery. Approaching them from the sea was obviously the most hazardous way to do so, and it would see men fighting through oozing mud flats surrounded by sharpened stakes. The Qing Navy held 4 new German-built destroyers equipped with rapid-firing guns, patrolling near the forts. To attack them by land was also not favorable. It would see men clambering over small canals, irrigation works, and behind the forts were the Boxers, who were infesting the towns of Tongku and Daku. Another issue was the Daku mud bar. It allowed only shallow water vessels to pass. The Allied navies only had around 9 ships that could pass. 3 British ships, the HMS Algerine, Fame and Whiting, the German Iltis, the Russian Gilyak, Borb, and Koreits, the French Liao, and Japanese Atago. 900 men consisting of 380 British, 300 Japanese, and the rest, Russian, Austrian, and Italian, were loaded aboard the 9 ships as the Allies, we shall call them from now on simply the Allies just to make it easier, awaited the deadline on June the 16th for the Qing to respond. All the warships arranged their broadsides aimed at the Daku forts with a bombardment ordered to commence at 2 a.m. if the Qing did not respond. However, the Qing did respond by opening fire at 12:50. As an eyewitness recalled, a shell shrieked over the Algerine in unpleasant proximity to her top masts. To this, 7 of the 9 Allied ships began opening fire. The Russian gunboat Gilyak made a poor decision turning her searchlight on, turning her immediately into the most prominent target. She was nearly sunk by all the shell fire. The HMS Fame and Whiting pulled in closer to try and capture the Qing destroyers, and within the mayhem, the 2 ships managed to slip upstream abreast of the 4 Qing destroyers. Lieutenant Keyes aboard the Fame recalled, "The shells were literally shrieking around us. Several fell just short and splashed muddy water right over us. Several pitched just over. We really had a charmed existence." The British destroyers cast out their whaler ships, holding dozens of men to board the Qing destroyers. The British sailors and Marines boarded the Qing destroyers with ease, capturing all 4 without firing a shot, and receiving not a single casualty. Lieutenant Keyes gave explicit orders to his men not to fire upon the Qing, who were in the process of escaping up the river bank. Meanwhile, the Russian gunboat Koreits was severely damaged by the opening salvo. The Monosasi, despite being at quite a distance, holding many women and children aboard, took a flung shell to her bow, luckily not hurting anyone. The Qing fort guns were very accurate, managing to hit the HMS Whiting, SMS Iltis, French Lion, and Gilyak, which was forced to ground herself lest she be sunk. Gilyak had 18 deaths and 65 wounded. Meanwhile, at 3 a.m., landing parties began to advance upon the forts, struggling through very thick mud. The first fort was at the north bank, and the landing forces came at it with bayonets pointed. British and Japanese troops were the first to scale its walls, and they were even racing another. British officer Craddock recalled, "I was frantic at the idea the Japanese were getting in first. They were very keen and in better condition than anyone else." The Union Jack was soon hoisted, followed by the rising red sun. The defenders of the fort made a symbolic defense before fleeing. As the men cheered, suddenly 2 Qing soldiers burst out of a gateway 20 yards away with bayonets fixed, firing their rifles as they marched forward from the hip. A lieutenant emptied his revolver at them and pulled out his sword to defend himself. The Allied troops raced towards the second fort of the northern bank as Allied shells struck its walls. The air was filled with dust and smoke as the Qing soldiers fired their guns until the last minute, upon which they all fled. There was to be barely a need to seize the southern forts. The Qing commander was seen galloping away on a white horse, and as the Shanghai Mercury put it, "The forts were a mass of ruins, rivers of blood with headless and armless bodies everywhere, which the blue jackets were gathering together and cremating in heaps." The Allied troops in the northern forts turned their guns on the southern forts. One shot hit a powder magazine, exploding a part of the southern fort's walls, creating a large fire. Through the smoke and dust, the Qing defenders could be seen abandoning the forts. By 6:30 a.m., the Battle of the Daku forts was all but done. By 8 a.m., many of the Allied troops were coming back aboard their ships. The Allies had suffered 172 casualties. Rivers of blood were seen all around the forts. Survivors of the carnage aboard the ships or the forts ate tinned beef, salmon, and ship biscuits, reflecting on their good fortune to be alive. With only 9 ships, the Allies had secured the mouth of the river. All in all, it was a very brave action, helped considerably with some luck. Many questioned its necessity, as it undoubtedly would increase the attacks upon the foreign legations in Beijing. Herbert Hoover recalled, "It was this act of aggression which marked the downfall of the moderate party in Peking, unmasked the gigantic plot of the powerful party behind the Boxers, and turned the government over definitively into their hands. No more favorable moment could have been chosen by our admirals to precipitate a general massacre." At the same time this was happening, MacDonald had been sending assurances to Empress Dowager Cixi that Britain wished to remain on friendly terms with China. Cixi was literally receiving reports of the attacks on the Daku forts as MacDonald's letters came in, and when he found out, he wrote, "This will sure put the old Buddha in a good temper." Back over in Tientsin's foreign settlement, people could hear loud gunfire coming from the Daku forts. At 8 a.m., Tientsin's foreign community received word the Daku forts had been taken, and now all wondered what would happen next. As recalled by Lou Hoover in Tientsin, "All the forenoon at Tientsin, there was an ominous silence. Nothing doing on either side, each waiting for the other to play the next card, neither knowing the result of the attack on Daku, and yet both sides knowing that now we were committed to a war, if not with China itself, with northern China and the Manchu dynasty." At 3 p.m., Qing artillery began to open fire upon the foreign settlement. Shells were hissing overhead, explosions followed everywhere. An alarm bell began to ring at the municipal hall as foreign residents ran through the streets. Rifle fire was cracking against brick walls as civilians dived for cover. It looked like a helpless situation. 600 foreign civilians were trapped in a mile-long by quarter-mile-wide area, bounded by a river on one side and a flat plain on the other. It was a maze of narrow alleys and single-storied Chinese houses, perfect conditions for snipers. The whole was enclosed by a mud wall around 15 feet high and wide enough for 4 people to stand across. As midshipman C.C. Dix recalled, "The prospect was hardly brilliant. Inside the settlement was a mixed force of 2,400 men, with 9 field guns and a few machine guns. Outside were 15,000 Imperial troops, with immense numbers of quick-firing guns. Their ammunition was of the best and practically unlimited, and they had the dreaded Boxers at their back." The most senior officer in Tientsin at the time was Russian Colonel Wolgak, who took control of the multinational force of Americans, Russians, Austrians, Germans, French, Japanese, and Italians. The exception, of course, were the British, who chose to be led by Captain Bailey of the HMS Aurora. The Russians deployed in a very exposed position, trying to defend the railway station on the opposite side of the river from the foreign settlement. They were in close proximity to the Chinese gravesite, some houses and ditches, places Qing snipers could hide. With the Russians were the French, who took up a position in front of the French concession at the north end of the settlement near the Daku road. The Americans defended a stretch with the British along the eastern side of the entire settlement. It was a very thin line. The Germans, Austrians, Japanese, and Italians deployed along the mud wall near the river bank. Civilians who were capable were given the task of policing, sentry, engineering, and medical duties. Herbert Hoover and his men were the only engineers in Tientsin. Colonel Wojak asked them to get people building up barricades. Hoover and the men frantically searched for Chinese laborers to help out, and any materials that were sturdy enough to create barricades. As Hoover recalled, "Soon we had 1,000 terrified Chinese Christians carrying and piling up walls of sacked grain and sugar along the exposed sides of the town and across the streets." Within the first hours of the battle, it seemed the Qing and Boxers would overrun them all. Hoover had this to say: "With the smoke of many burning buildings pouring over the settlement, with the civilians erecting barricades across the streets for the final rush, the terrific bombardment, the constant sound of rifle fire in the distance, and the knowledge, if not the sight, of the scores of wounded brought in from the lines, it all seemed bad, very bad. It was really the climax of terror, of the black fear, as it was of the fighting. And this was the black fear, not that the siege would be successful and we should be compelled to lower our flag and surrender to an honorable enemy, but that, if every man fought to his utmost strength and was beaten, there without Chinamen, mobs of Chinamen, at their very worst, barbarians who knew no quarter." The women, children, and non-combatants huddled in fear within the catacombs beneath Gordon Hall, the most robust stone municipal building available. The Qing assault was first directed at the railway station. Upon seeing this, Commander Beatty formed a bridge of boats and took sailors across to reinforce the Russians, but they soon became pinned down. The sailors tried to hide amongst some Russian artillery horse carriages, as Chinese artillery and snipers fired hell upon them. The Allied forces had to allow the Chinese to approach closer because their artillery and snipers were wielding an enormous advantage. No one could stand upright unless they wanted shrapnel or sniper bullets to hit them. Those who did advance were armed Boxers, who were driven off by volley fire from the defenders. The defenders could not know this, but the Boxers and Qing, despite appearances, were not really coordinating together. The Qing troopers were awaiting orders from Beijing whether they were to support the Boxers or to protect the foreigners. It was only a result of the attack upon the Daku forts that finally led the Qing government to officially take the side of the Boxers, and orders began to trickle over to support them. Despite the official orders, there were many in the Qing court who were moderates, and they were sending counter orders to the commanders out in the field, telling them not to support the Boxers, just to put up a symbolic effort in battle. General Nishicheng led the forces in the field overall, and he had his artillery fire constantly. It was reported nearly 60,000 shells would be fired upon the foreign settlements. These shells, however, much akin to what occurred during the First Sino-Japanese War, were not all exploding upon impact. Corruption was still rampant, and the shells were quite lackluster in their results. The Boxers who did advance were quickly met with volleys at close range, and Beatty noted of the Russians, "They worked their guns like men, scorning to build up protection with the bales of goods that were there and which we utilized for our riflemen." Commander Beatty was less impressed with the Germans, who continuously sent messages stating that they were under heavy attack and required reinforcements, lest they be forced to abandon their positions. According to Beatty, the Germans were a crying wolf, and he made it clear that they would receive no reinforcements from the British. Sailors and Marines pushed through against Qing and Boxer infiltrators, tossing them out. The Allied forces formed a closed ring around the civilians, as Hoover described it. "It was in the center that the melodrama and comedy were played. The rim was nearly all tragedy." Sniper fire was coming from within the settlements, prompting wild hunts. Chinese Christians within the settlement, numbering around 3,000 to 4,000, were prime targets for Boxer attacks. Herbert Hoover's wife, Lou Hoover, volunteered at the hospital using a bicycle to move between alleys, and had a sniper bullet hit her tire once. The hospital saw around 200 wounded brought in every day, people requiring bandages, bedding, dressings, disinfections, all of which were in short supply. Tientsin was under siege. Herbert Hoover bicycled around the defensive perimeter, braving the streets to see his barricades were working. The situation was incredibly stressful for the civilians, cooped all together, while artillery and gunfire raged outside their buildings. According to Herbert Hoover, many friendships ended because of the stress, and he recalled, "No one will again dare to organize a dinner party in Tientsin without consulting an inmate of Gordon Hall. For how could Mrs. E ever sit at meat again with Mrs. F? Who slapped Mrs. E's Peking pug?" So what I gathered from that quote was that somebody slapped a pug. War never changes. By the 22nd of June, things were becoming critical. Commander Beatty had been shot, and he was losing a ton of blood after he attempted seizing the enemy's gun in a narrow escape when a shell burst right in front of him. The men fighting in the barricades were mutilated by shell fire and gunshot. Contact with Daku had all been lost on the 17th. Casualties were piling up, and the settlement was completely surrounded. There was no escape. The only reason the settlement had not already been overrun was because the Qing and Boxers were not working in concert. Their efforts should have been directed to simultaneously hit all fronts, but they were not doing so. The Russians sent word that if the fighting continued the way it had been for the past 4 days, their ammunition would run out, and they advised preparing a nighttime escape. Their recommendation was for the women, children, wounded, and sick to be escorted by the Germans, Austrians, French, Japanese, and Italians, while the Russians and British would perform a rearguard. Upon hearing this, the very injured Commander Beatty remarked, "It was the maddest, wildest, damnedest, rottenest scheme that could emanate from the brain of any man. Doing this would mean abandoning Seymour to certain destruction." Beatty made it known to the Russians the British would not comply. Unbeknownst to them all, help was on its way and quite close by. On June the 19th, my birthday, random factoid, a young British volunteer, James Watts, set out with 3 Cossacks in an attempt to make contact with Daku. The men rode out through hostile villages as Boxers tried to attack them. Watts carried a message from Captain Bailey stating, "Hard pressed, heavy fighting, losses, 150 killed and wounded. Chinese Imperial artillery shelling the settlement. Women and children are all in the cellars. Fires all over the settlement. Everyone worn out with insistent fighting." A rescue force of Russian infantry and American Marines had already been dispatched, but they were pinned down near the outskirts of Tientsin. According to one American gunnery sergeant, "We fell into a trap. We laid on our faces with the bullets coming over like hail, not knowing what to do. We fell and got up, staggered, crawled, but got out. I never saw such a tired party in my life, and yours truly was on the hog." The force was 131 U.S. Marines and 400 Russians who got ambushed just 2 miles from the city. The Americans suffered 3 deaths and 13 wounded before they withdrew back to Daku. Bailey's message made it clear a more substantial force was required. Daku and her forts were left with just 1,000 men to garrison her, as the Allies prepared an expeditionary force. Luck was theirs again, as 2 new warships arrived. The HMS Terrible from Hong Kong, carrying 300 Royal Welch Fusiliers, and a Russian troop ship from Port Arthur carrying hundreds of Russian troops. On June the 23rd, a multinational force of 2,000 men set out, which also held the British 1st Chinese Regiment from Weiwei, so even some Chinese troops were in their ranks. They rushed up to Tientsin, reaching it the very same day, and upon seeing them, the Qing and Boxers dispersed to the east. Lou Hoover described the scene at their arrival to Tientsin as such. "A good many hundred civilians and a couple of thousand troops sat still and repelled faint-hearted charges, while 10,000 or 15,000 Chinese troops and 20,000 Boxers plucked shells of all sizes into us for exactly 1 week, without a sound or a word from the outside reaching us. Then the first relief cut their way into us. Enough to get in, but not to do anything more than we could when they got there. With the Chinese siege lifted momentarily, the lines of communication and supplies from Daku to Tientsin were quickly restored. However, Tientsin's battle was nowhere close to being over, as the Qing and Boxers would quickly remount their siege. Now back over in Beijing, the foreign legations woke up to their first day of siege on the 21st. The first hours of the siege brought panic. The Austrians from the offset abandoned their isolated legation to fall back upon the French barricades, leaving the northeast sector in the enemy hands. The next day, Professor Hubert E. James, who had been working with missionaries at the Feu Palace, calmly walked up to the North Bridge going over the canal. He gave the appearance of someone trying to parley, but Qing troops on the other side shot him dead upon the bridge. They all awaited Seymour's rescue party, but it was not to be seen. A letter from Captain McCullough, Seymour's second-in-command, dated June the 14th, managed to pass through to the American legation. The letter had been written 35 miles from Beijing, and whose contents were nothing more than small chat, indicating nothing about when they would arrive. On June the 22nd, by 9 a.m., the Italians, Austrian, French, German, Japanese, Russian, and American detachments suddenly abandoned their positions and frantically ran to the British legation. Three-quarters of the legation quarter defenses were left undefended, including the Feu Palace, which had nearly the entire Chinese Christian population that had fled into the legation quarters. Everyone was in a tremendous panic. It turned out a single man had caused it all. Captain von Thommen of the Austrian cruiser Zenta, from whom at the offset of hostilities had been trying to take command of the defenses for the legations, went into a panic when he reported that an American Marine told him the American legation had to be abandoned immediately. Von Thommen lost his wits at the news, and without verifying it to be true or not, he began screaming to everyone that all the forces east of the Canal Street had to retire immediately to the British legation. So yeah, everyone just blindly began running. Once everyone figured out what had happened, all the troops were ordered to retake their positions, but in the mayhem, the Italian legations were already burning down. Boxers and Qing forces occupied the Allied barricades in Custom Street, but had failed to press their advantage any further. Von Thommen was relieved of command, and now it was MacDonald in command. MacDonald was an ex-soldier, but held little experience in guerrilla-styled warfare that they faced. MacDonald also had no official control over any non-British forces. MacDonald would write orders down and give it to the respective ministers who would arrange them to be carried out by their national troops. It was a terrible system, but it was all that they had. One of MacDonald's first orders was to dispatch the Italian guards, who had no legation to guard anymore, to help the Japanese with the Feu Palace. If the Feu Palace were to fall, the French, German, and Japanese legations would be cut off from the British legation, which was the last stronghold. MacDonald took a stock of the legation's defenses. Over 400 men, 20 officers, and 389 men of 8 differing nations. They were supplemented by 2 bands of armed volunteers. The first were 75 men with some military experience, such as Nigel Oliphant of the Chinese Imperial Bank, who had served with the Scots Greys. There was Captain Poole of the East Yorkshire Regiment, and Captain Labrousse of the Infanterie de Marine. The second group were more amateurish, titled the Carving Knife Brigade because of their variety of weapons, going from elephant rifles to des fusils de chasse. Professionals and amateurs alike were all short of ammunition, and each nationality was using different weapons with different types of ammunition, making it a nightmare logistically. The legation had only one piece of real artillery, the Italian 1-pounder, that too held little ammunition. Their lines of defense had shrunk alarmingly. After just the second day, they only had 7 legations to defend. The outliers, such as the Belgian and Dutch legations, had been abandoned at the very beginning. The Austrians shortly after, and the Italians lost theirs during the von Thommen confusion. The area they defended was now 700 yards east to west from the Russian and American legations, and 750 yards north to south from the Feu Palace and the British legation, to the north and the Tartar Wall in the south. Sandwiched between these were the Japanese, Spanish, and German legations, alongside some other buildings. All of the legations, excluding the British one, were on Legation Street. The Germans and Americans were on the south side of the street, overshadowed by the massive Tartar Wall. MacDonald knew the Tartar Wall had to be held at all cost. If it was taken, anyone from its top could just lob incendiaries down, spelling doom. The British legation grounds quickly became the place everyone congregated to, searching for further information. Everyone was starved to know what was going on outside. Meanwhile, the Chinese Christians were doing their part helping with labor, an invaluable aspect to the defenders' plight. There was also the issue of having to watch over them, lest the enemy infiltrate using them as cover. The foreigners and Chinese likewise were introduced to the hazard of fire, which was constantly an issue. Boxers would toss torches and firecrackers at all hours trying to burn the legations out. It was all too easy for the Boxers to dip rags in kerosene, attach it to the end of a long bamboo pole, and light something ablaze. On the 22nd, many buildings in the western sector were lit on fire, and it took the defenders a very long time to put it all out. The first casualty for the British was to be Private Escalating, who was shot dead as he stood watch while the fire committee went to work putting out fires. The very next day was the same. The Chinese tried to burn them out again. This time they aimed for the Hanlin Academy, just due north of the British legation. Thousands of silk-covered books were there. It was a tremendous tragedy to try and burn the place. On the morning of the 23rd, the enemy was spotted running through the 4-acre compound, tossing torches soaked in petrol around. The foreigners were stunned the Chinese would burn such a place, but burn it they did. The fire teams tried to put the flames out, but the Chinese were firing down upon anyone who would go near the academy. Eventually, MacDonald sent some Royal Marines to go through a hole in the wall, getting into the academy where firefighting efforts were organized. Scholars amongst the foreign community were in despair, knowing the academic treasures were being burnt. Morrison had this to say: "The combustible books, the most valuable in the empire, were thrown in a great heap into the pond round the summer house. A heap of debris, timber and ashes, sprinkled with torn leaves, marked the site of a great library of the Middle Kingdom. What can we think of a nation that sacrifices its most sacred edifice, the pride and glory of its country, and learned men for hundreds of years, in order to be revenged upon foreigners? It was a glorious blaze. The desecration was appalling." By the nighttime, the fire was still burning as soot-covered firefighters struggled. Other fires were seen that day. The Russo-Chinese bank containing $80,000 of cash was burned down, many official houses alongside it. But the greatest tragedy had to be the burning of the Hanlin Academy. So much knowledge gone up, like the fires in Alexandria. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Do you want something more on the bizarre and crazy side? Check out my recent episode on the Ramree Island Massacre, where, allegedly, thousands of saltwater crocodiles attacked some Japanese. Truth is, it didn't happen. You can also check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. Over there, I allow all my patrons to vote on the next subject that'll be tackled, and it can be pretty much anything. So please, check it out. The battle for the Daku forts was won at a small cost, but the battle for Tientsin and Beijing would rage on for many more days. Time was of the essence if the Allies were to reach the foreign legations in Beijing to save their countrymen.